2,200 Marines have just boarded a U.S. warship, and right now almost nobody in Washington seems willing to explain to the public what that really signals. 14 days. That is how long this war has now been running. 14 days since American and Israeli aircraft began pounding Iranian military infrastructure in what Pentagon officials first described as a rapid, decisive operation. 14 days since the most strategically important energy choke point on Earth effectively went dark. 14 days since oil markets started whipsawing from roughly $88 to $117 a barrel, sending shockwaves through fuel markets, shipping costs, inflation forecasts, and virtually every major economy on the planet. And on day 14, a reporter asked President Donald Trump a direct question: when does this end? Trump paused, thought for a beat, and then answered in a way that should concern anyone paying attention. He said he would know when he felt it in his bones. Not when a ceasefire is signed. Not when the Strait of Hormuz reopens. Not when diplomats reach a framework. Not when Tehran surrenders. When he personally feels it. If you want fast, clear updates on stories like this before the spin sets in, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because what is happening here is moving by the hour. That answer from the president tells you a great deal about where this conflict actually stands. Because on the very same day Trump said those words, the Pentagon was loading 2,200 Marines onto a Navy amphibious assault ship in Japan, not symbolic personnel, not support staff, Marines, armed infantry, helicopter gunships, special operations elements, armored vehicles, landing craft designed for contested littoral operations. The USS Tripoli, a large-deck amphibious assault vessel, is now moving toward the Persian Gulf. The official mission is being described as support for efforts to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Pause there for a second and let the significance of that settle in. 2 weeks of one of the most intense American air campaigns in decades. More than 15,000 Iranian targets reportedly struck, and the strait is still not open, so now the Marines are moving. To understand why that deployment changes the entire shape of this war, you have to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually looks like from a military perspective. It is not just a narrow lane of water on a map. It is a heavily exposed battle space that military planners have spent years studying and warning about. At its narrowest point, the strait is only about 33 kilometers wide. That is it. On one side sits Iran, with hundreds of kilometers of coastline layered with anti-ship missile sites, mobile launch platforms, hardened storage areas, underground facilities, radar support, and command nodes built over decades for one purpose: making any hostile naval transit through that channel dangerous, costly, and uncertain. These are not ad hoc systems assembled during a crisis. Iran has spent years investing in a coastal denial architecture designed specifically to deter or punish any attempt to force passage. And here is the part that does not always make it into the public briefings. Many of those missile systems do not need to sit directly on the shoreline to be effective. Some have ranges measured in the hundreds of kilometers. A launcher positioned inland, protected and concealed, can still threaten a ship operating in the strait. That matters because it means an air campaign can strike visible sites day after day and still fail to fully eliminate the threat. And before we go any further, if you also want breaking international updates like this first, before the polished talking points hit cable television, subscribe to the channel now. We are tracking this story closely, and the next few days could be decisive. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says more than 15,000 Iranian targets have been hit in 2 weeks. That is a staggering number, but the continued closure of the strait tells you the central military fact that no podium statement can erase. The missile threat has not been neutralized, and the reason is straightforward. Iran's system was built to survive exactly this kind of assault. Launchers are mobile, missiles are stored underground, crews disperse. Equipment relocates the moment targeting patterns become visible. Hitting a fixed launcher in a known location is one challenge. Eliminating every mobile launcher, every resupply point, every underground storage site, and every operational crew spread across a long defensive coastline is a far larger and more complex problem. That problem is still unsolved. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent confirmed this week that the United States plans to move toward naval escorts for commercial shipping through the strait. But he also made something else clear. Before escorts can safely move, the land-based anti-ship threat has to be reduced to an acceptable level. That sequencing makes sense in theory. In practice, however, Iran has now had 2 full weeks to study American strike patterns and adapt. Any launcher sitting in a known place at the outset of the war likely is not there now. Intelligence built over years through satellite imagery, signal collection, and pattern analysis has been degraded by the very conflict it was designed to support. The Marines are not being sent into a fully secured environment. They are being sent into a battle space that still has to be shaped. Then came Friday's Pentagon briefing, one of the most striking of the war so far. Hegseth stood before reporters and declared that Iran's air force was effectively gone, its navy shattered, its production lines destroyed, and its leadership desperate, hiding underground. He used the word rats. He went even further and claimed that the new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, appointed just a week earlier after the death of his father, was wounded and likely disfigured. No image was released. No medical documentation was provided. No declassified intelligence was shown. The claim was simply made and then amplified. But within hours, events on the ground in Tehran complicated that narrative. Massive crowds assembled for Quds Day, the annual state-backed rally in support of Palestine. In broad daylight, in front of cameras, among those visible were Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian and Ali Larijani, now one of the most important power brokers in Iran's national security apparatus. This was the same Larijani who, just days earlier, warned that if the United States struck Iran's power grid, Tehran could respond in ways that would ripple across the entire Middle East. These were not images of a regime entirely underground or absent from public space. They were images of a state signaling endurance. That disconnect may be the clearest snapshot of where this war stands right now. Washington is projecting collapse. Tehran is projecting continuity. The Pentagon says leadership is broken and cowering. Tehran stages a mass public event with senior figures visible. And into that strategic gap, the United States is now moving 2,200 Marines. But the battlefield is only part of the story, because while Washington and Tehran trade bombs, threats, and briefings, another front of this conflict is unfolding in the global economy. The shipping collapse in the Strait of Hormuz is not stabilizing, it is getting worse. According to shipping intelligence data, only a fraction of the normal vessel traffic has moved through the strait in recent weeks. The comparison to the same period last year is shocking. Traffic is down by roughly 94%. More than 1,000 commercial vessels are reportedly waiting outside the area rather than risk passage. Why? Because even if a government says the route is technically open, commercial shipping operates on insurance, risk, crew safety, and cost. And the insurance market has essentially stepped back. When underwriters are unwilling to price the risk at levels shipping companies can tolerate, traffic collapses regardless of what politicians say. No major shipping firm wants to send crews into a narrow waterway where missiles, drones, and fast attack threats remain active and where the military situation changes by the hour. And here is where the geopolitical fallout gets even more interesting. Europe is not simply waiting for Washington to solve the problem. Germany, France, and Italy have reportedly opened quiet channels to Tehran, asking for passage arrangements. Not ordering, not threatening, asking. India has gone even further, with reports that Indian diplomats negotiated a bilateral understanding that would allow certain liquefied petroleum gas cargoes through as part of direct talks with Iran. In other words, countries aligned with the United States are quietly making their own arrangements with the country the United States is bombing. That is not a side story. That is Iran's strategy at work. Tehran may not be able to win a conventional military victory against the United States, but it can fracture the political environment around the conflict. It can create enough economic pressure and enough diplomatic divergence that the unified front Washington expected begins to fray. And that appears to be exactly what is happening. The world is not rallying neatly around an American-led campaign. Much of the world is looking for a way to protect its own energy flows first. What makes this even more troubling is that Central Command planners reportedly admitted to Congress this week that a prolonged, successful Iranian closure of the strait was not fully built into the original operating assumptions. The expectation before February 28th was a short campaign, quick strikes, rapid degradation of Iranian command and control, mounting internal pressure inside Iran, maybe even a political fracture at the top. Trump himself reportedly suggested it could all be wrapped up in 4 days, maybe a week. It is now day 14, and that assumption looks badly outdated. And the command structure inside Iran is now part of the problem. Trump reportedly told G7 leaders this week that Mojtaba Khamenei is, in his words, not in good shape, and that it is unclear who is truly in charge. Read that carefully because it matters enormously. The President of the United States is effectively saying that the opposing side in this war may not currently have a clear, reachable authority capable of formally ending it. No reliable chain, no obvious negotiating counterpart, no simple off-ramp. That creates a nightmare scenario for diplomacy. Iran's Revolutionary Guard has its own reasons to keep the conflict going. It answers to the supreme leader. But if the supreme leader is incapacitated, hidden, or politically constrained, then the people with the guns and the operational networks may have every incentive to continue escalation rather than seek compromise. Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, reportedly signaled through Omani channels that Washington was open to stopping the war. Tehran's response came publicly and defiantly. Larijani, appearing at the Quds Day gathering, rejected the overture outright. The strait remains closed. The campaign continues. Tehran's stated position is maximalist. The United States leaves the region, and American bases in the Middle East are shut down. At the same time, the United States has put a $10 million bounty through the Rewards for Justice program on Mojtaba Khamenei and added several other senior Iranian officials, including Larijani and top security figures, to the list. That means Washington is now offering money for information on the whereabouts of a man it has not publicly confirmed as healthy, incapacitated, or even fully operational. That is not where this war was expected to be 2 weeks in. So what happens now? The Marines will arrive. The bombing will continue. Oil will keep swinging. Governments that publicly align with Washington will continue making quiet calculations about their own economic survival. Strategic petroleum reserves will keep absorbing pressure, even though they were never meant to replace the world's most critical energy route indefinitely. And the military question that matters most is still unresolved. What exactly is the plan if air power has reached its practical limit and the waterway remains contested? Because here is the strategic truth no administration official can comfortably say out loud. You do not surge a Marine expeditionary force into a theater where the air campaign has fully achieved the political and operational objective. You send that kind of force when the air campaign has hit the edge of what it can do on its own and the mission still is not complete. The objective is not just punishing Iran, the objective is reopening the Strait of Hormuz. The strait is still effectively shut. That is why the Marines are moving. And that brings us to the question almost nobody in Washington wants to answer directly. What happens after the Marines arrive and the strait is still under threat? What happens if escort operations begin and Iran retains enough missile capacity, mine-laying ability, fast boat swarming potential, or drone reach to keep the route commercially unusable? What is the day-after plan when one of the most intense bombing campaigns in modern military history runs into the hard limit of what air power alone can achieve?